Professor Yael Lavender-Smith joined OU just this past year as an instructor of Hebrew in the Department of Modern Literature, Languages, and Linguistics. We're extremely happy that Yael has joined us. It has already enabled us to offer Hebrew at more levels, at more times, and has also freed up Yael and Professor Ori Kritz to do a little bit in the realm of Jewish and Israeli literature and languages, and which we really have not been able to do for quite a long time. So we're thrilled that she's joined us. Professor Lavender-Smith is a native of Binyamina, Israel, and received her BA magna cum laude and her MA from the University of Haifa in Israel. She received her doctoral degree from CUNY, that is the City University of New York, the Graduate Center. She's won already quite a few awards, which I will not get into at great length, except to say that she won the Chancellor's Award at CUNY, which, as everybody knows, these Chancellor's Awards are always highly competitive and always go to the best of scholars. Yael's dissertation, which will also be the main subject, I assume, for today's talk. I didn't read her dissertation, I have to admit it. Can't read everything. But her dissertation was on a fascinating figure, the 17th century Jewish convert, Dr. Uriel da Costa, who was one of several converts in the Amsterdam Jewish community of the 17th century, the truly fascinating Jewish community dubbed Dutch Jerusalem by the late historian Selo Baron. And today, Professor Lavender-Smith, who knows Latin, who knows Hebrew, who knows all sorts of other languages as well, will be speaking, and you can see it yourself, on transformations of Uriel da Costa and Don Quixote in a talk called Fictionalized Identities. And I'm extremely glad to introduce Professor Yael Lavender-Smith.
Shalom, everybody. Time. First of all, thank you all for coming. Can you hear me, by the way? Good. I want to thank Alan Levinson so much for inviting me to give this talk today, and I'll get right to business. Uriel da Costa is unknown. Uriel da Costa is unknown to many. If you did hear about him, he is usually known as one of the Jewish heretics in the early modern period, one who published against the Jewish community, or as a tragic figure with a heartbreaking story. Don Quixote is a pretty well-known fictional character, one who embarked on a journey to right the wrongs in society and created a comedy of errors along the way. Nevertheless, they both occupy an equal space in the title of today's lecture, The Transformations of Uriel da Costa and Don Quixote, though da Costa appears before Don Quixote. To understand that position, allow me to tell you a little bit about Uriel da Costa. Da Costa was born Gabriel da Costa in Porto, Portugal in 1583 or 1584. In 1640, at the age of 57, da Costa committed suicide, and his autobiography, Exemplar of Human Life, is found next to his body. Here in this painting, we see the child Spinoza with Uriel da Costa. Uriel da Costa is passing to the child Spinoza his anti-rabbinic views And the contrast between the characters is striking. Da Costa is painting in dark colors, Spinoza is painting in bright colors, blonde hair. What this painting by Shmuel Hirschenberg, and what is even more striking in this painting is that it is completely imaginative. The two figures never met. What we do know about Da Costa's life and suicide is based on his autobiography and on archival research. He begins the exemplar by describing his family's relations to Judaism. Da Costa's relatives were conversos, also known as Marranos or crypto-Jews. Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity during the 15th century, and many of them maintained their Jewish identity in secret and passed it along from generation to generation. Da Costa and his family were conversos. Practicing Judaism was prohibited in Portugal, and in order to practice Judaism freely, Uriel leaves his home and his country and moves with his immediate family to Amsterdam. So Portugal is on the left side of the map, and Amsterdam is in the Netherlands at the top. In Amsterdam, Uriel joins the Orthodox Jewish community. However, the moment of his formal religious conversion is also the moment in which Uriel departs from formal rabbinic Judaism. It is in Amsterdam that Da Costa's perception of Judaism, based on the literal biblical doctrine that is on the Hebrew Bible, clashes with the oral tradition, based on rabbinical interpretation and Talmudic tradition. That is, Da Costa believed that Judaism is based on the Hebrew Bible alone, but Judaism is drawn on interpretation of the rabbis and on the oral tradition. Therefore, Da Costa challenges the rabbis by sending a list of 11 differences between the Bible and the oral law to the leaders of the Jewish community in Venice in 1616. For example, he asked a question about phylactery, that tefillin that men put on their arms and their forehead, arguing that it is not based on the Hebrew Bible, but rather on the oral tradition. Da Costa undermines the authority of the rabbis a few more times, and eventually he was excommunicated or banned by the Jewish Society of Amsterdam. What does this excommunication, or what we call in Hebrew cherem, entail? A prison without bars, excommunication was a form of punishment that excluded and isolated a person from a community. But it was not always an act of isolation. At times an individual was denied only a certain right, for example, participating in formal ritual or holding a formal position in the Jewish community. When the time elapsed, the individual may return to the community as long as he repented for his actions. In the exemplar, Da Costa describes the price he had to pay as a result of his cherem. I quote, "Many of them spit upon me as they passed by me in the streets and encouraged their children to do the same. If I was sick, nobody would attend me. If I labored under any misfortune, it was a matter of triumph and joy to them." End quote. Da Costa is cut from the Jewish society. He is a present absence. He is what I call the other within. Da Costa was excommunicated for 7 years until in 1639 he reconciles with the Jewish society and the excommunication is removed. But as he repents, Da Costa goes through a humiliating ceremony. Da Costa describes his reconciliation with the Jewish society in the exemplar. In that description, Da Costa emphasizes its corporality and its effect on the body. After removing his shirt, he suffers, I quote, 39 stripes with a scourge of leather tongue, end quote, after which he is stepped upon by members of the Jewish community. The physical aspect of the ritual is heightened but does not bother Da Costa as much as its effect on the audience. I quote, "Now let anyone who has heard my story judge how decent a spectacle it was to see an old man, a person of no mean rank and who was, moreover, naturally exceedingly modest, stripped before a numerous congregation of men, women, and children, and scourged by order of his judges. Let him imagine the confusion and anguish such a one must suffer." End quote. After his flogging, Da Costa becomes fixed to the ground, prevented from movement. Though the confusion and agony of the experience is significant for Da Costa, who is the one who tells the story, the audience's gaze is of equal importance. Here I'm referring to two types of audience. The internal audience, that is the men, women, and children that were present in the ceremony in the synagogue, and the external audience, that is the readers of the text. He is interested in both the external and the internal audiences, both in the readers and the men, women, and children who were present in the synagogue. When this flogging happens, the gaze of the internal audience in the synagogue highlights the fragility of the old man and the immorality of stripping a modest man in front of others. The gaze of the external audience, the external readers, is directed both to the humiliating moment, but also to the leaders of the Jewish community who performed the removal of the cherem. As Da Costa is fixed to the ground, his image is also fixed or imprinted in the text and in the imagination of his readers. Da Costa asks his readers to be the judges of his judges by bestowing them with the power of imagination. In 6040, as a result of this public trauma, Da Costa commits suicide. This history, however, is hazy, and some of the details here, drawn from his autobiography, counter archival research. What interests me about Da Costa is the literary persona he is trying to create in the exemplar. When critics refer to Da Costa's sense of honor and refusal to submit to Jewish authorities, some refer to a familiar literary character, Don Quixote. Jose Thao writes that Da Costa addresses, and I quote, his imaginary enemies in Quixote-esque terms, end quote. Henry Meshulam alludes to Don Quixote when describing Da Costa's rebellious acts against Jewish orthodoxy. And I quote, "Don Quixote-like, Da Costa described himself as God's paladin, the only defender of true Judaism against the rabbis." End quote. I would like to extend the metaphor and further compare Da Costa with Don Quixote from a literary point of view. My project, which is still a work in progress, shows that transformation narratives in the early modern period reflect both formation of identities that are rooted in reading and text, and consequently, the need for interpretation. Though the novel Don Quixote was an immediate success, even after the publication of the first part in 1605, there is no evidence that Da Costa was familiar with this book. I do not argue here that Da Costa's exemplar draws on Don Quixote. Rather, I would like to illustrate how themes from Don Quixote elucidate certain aspects of Da Costa's narrative. Specifically, Don Quixote creates an imaginary world and transforms himself into a fictional character based on his reading of romances and books of chivalry. Similarly, reading for Da Costa was transformative. There was no Jewish public life in Portugal, and Da Costa could not find a rabbi who would teach him the religion of his ancestors. He thus created Judaism out of his individual interpretation of the Bible. Don Quixote goes through what I call interfictional transformation. Let me explain. An interfictional transformation is a transformation of a literary character that is influenced by literature and is grounded in literature and in reading. Much like the transformation of Don Quixote, Da Costa's conversion narrative illustrates the deep connection between the text and identity. That is, the text is a means to create and negotiate identity. Da Costa's narrative also points to the connections between interpretation and transformation, religious or otherwise. Transformations in this context depend on textual interpretation. To explain these terms, I would like to talk about Don Quixote's moment of transformation, the moment in which Cervantes allows us to enter Quixote's imagination. Cervantes opened the book Don Quixote with the word somewhere in La Mancha. So, somewhere in La Mancha, Alonso Quijano decides to become a knight-errant and travel the world. Quijano is the name of Don Quixote before he becomes a knight. Quijano transforms into a knight-errant, a figure from chivalric romances. He changes his name to Don Quixote de la Mancha, dons his armor, and crosses the boundary lines of class, reason, and sanity. In Book 1, Don Quixote names himself and his horse, he cleans his armor, and out of desire to find a lady to love, he says, if I, because of my evil sins or my good fortune, meet with a giant somewhere, as ordinarily befalls knights errant, and I unseat him with a single blow, or in short conquer and defeat him, would it not be good to have someone to whom I can send him, so that he might enter and fall to his knees before my sweet lady, and say in the humble voice of surrender, I, lady, am the giant Caraculiambro, lord of the island Malinrania, defeated in a single combat by the never sufficiently praised knight Don Quixote of La Mancha, who commanded me to appear before your ladyship so that your highness might dispose of me as you choose. Before this speech, the narrator describes the transformation. I quote, he too, like a good knight, wanted to add the name of his birthplace. At this point, Quixote resembles a knight, but he has yet to become one himself. And he has yet to cross the boundary lines of his reason. After this speech, however, the narrator immediately mentions, oh, how pleased our good knight was. Before the speech, he was like a knight, but after the speech, he was a knight. That is, that speech marks the midpoint between Quijano's sanity and Quixote's madness. Why then does Don Quixote's speech play such a significant part in his transformation? This is the first time in the narrative in which Don Quixote speaks. The narrator allows us to enter a unique place, the hero's illusion. Alonso Quijano's imagination and flawed logic create a world in which Don Quixote can exist. Before the speech, in his own mind, he has yet to become a knight-errant. In this speech, he plays a double role. The knight Quixote who identifies himself with a fictional situation, if I meet the giant somewhere, and the defeated giant, lady and the giant, Caraculiambro. He is both the conqueror and the conquered, both the self and the other. Here the blurring between self and other points to metamorphosis as a process of creating identity. It is not the disappearance of Quijano that defines Quixote's identity, but rather the presence of Quijano, Quixote, and the giants. That is the coexistence of the real and the imaginary. The I that has narrated the illusionary speech is a mixture of different selves. Don Quixote's identity is polarized by assuming oppositions. the knight, the giant, the conqueror, the conquered, the real and the imaginary. He establishes a division between the familiar knight and the unfamiliar giant, not realizing that the knight Don Quixote is the double of Quijano as well. Crossing, excuse me, crossing the boundary lines of reason, Quixote has now completed his physical and mental transformation. Moreover, the speech is significant in that it initiates an action. On the next day, Don Quixote will arm himself and embark on a journey. Cervantes also invites the reader on a journey, one that depicts the world in an unfamiliar way. Through Quixote's eyes, the world is in a constant transformation, but it doesn't go through a processual development of the cosmos from the creation of the world to present day, like in the classical works of Hesiod or Ovid. Rather, the reader sees images of radical transformation. For example, giants turn to windmill. All the fabulous images of Don Quixote's imagination unravel as unfamiliar, mundane, and even grotesque. The reader is invited to see double, to see the world as divided, to look at it from Don Quixote's point of view, and to recognize its absurdity at the same time. Da Costa also goes through a transformation, a religious one that is initiated by reading. In the exemplar, Da Costa insists that he had discovered Judaism solely from reading the Bible, though archival research contradicts this claim. Uriel da Costa studied the canon law, but early on, doubts and difficulties with Christianity began to overwhelm him. He decides to read the books of Moses and the prophets, spotting contradictions between the Old and the New Testaments. Da Costa decides to become a convert to the law of Moses. That is, he decides to convert to a form of Judaism based on his interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, or at least this is how he presents it. Reading, however, was not a passive process. Da Costa adds, "And the more time I bestow upon them, upon books, the greater difficulties still rose upon me." End quote. Da Costa depicts here the transformative power of reading. Reading religious and spiritual books initiates his process of religious transformation. Such a process figures prominently in conversion narrative, such as in Augustine's Confessions. Da Costa clearly shows that his narrative of conversion influences others, his mother and his brother. He had communicated, I had communicated to them, he writes, my sentiments on the falsity of our religion. Da Costa depicts himself as the one who initiates his family's conversion. He influences others and shapes their process of conversion. This process leads to action. In order to practice Judaism, Da Costa leaves his birthplace and his father's house. The native land and the father's house constitute for Da Costa his basic education and value system. Da Costa's process of conversion necessarily entailed that he leave the house of his father as well as his native land, which does not allow him to practice Judaism. As always, literacy is transformative, and especially to these people. Hence, the process of reading leads Da Costa to the religion of his ancestors. It leads to his idiosyncratic reading of the Hebrew Bible, to a rejection of Christianity as a false religion, and initiated action, leaving Portugal. In Amsterdam, Da Costa and the rest of the men in his family get circumcised, thus formally converting to Judaism. Da Costa assumes a new name, Uriel. It is in Amsterdam that Da Costa's perception of Judaism based on the literal biblical doctrine clashes with the oral tradition based on rabbinical interpretation and Talmudic tradition. Conversion to Judaism requires one to change dietary habits, follow new sets of rituals, break ties with one's past. Men were also required to go through circumcision. That is, conversion to Judaism affected many aspects of one's life. Readers familiar with conversion narratives seem to expect that da Costa's conversion will have a dramatic culmination, like in St. Augustine's narrative, in which the moment of conversion takes place after 8 books of doubt, and when it finally materializes, it involves mystics and mysterious elements. But the formal conversion and assimilation into the Jewish society are described in passing by da Costa. He writes, "Having finished our voyage and being arrived at Amsterdam, where we found the Jews professing their religion with great freedom as the law directs them, we immediately fulfilled the precept concerning circumcision." It is quite dry and mundane description, which is strikingly different from the Tolle Lege episode in St. Augustine's Confessions. It is also the moment in which the narrative changes its function, as da Costa realizes that the custom of the Jews are, and I quote, "very different from those commanded by Moses," end quote. In Quixote's transformation, he assumes the oppositions, the giant and the knight, the conquered and the conqueror, the imaginary and the real. The Costa narrative is a transformation narrative inside out. It models its first paragraphs on familiar narratives of transformation, but as the moment of assimilation into the Jewish society arrives, its function is transformed into a narrative that depicts a failed process of conversion. The conversion's empty promises and unmet expectations. Rather than finding the answer in religion, da Costa shows the inability of religion to provide answers. Rather than finding a source of comfort in the religious community, da Costa shows its failing. And instead of a narrative that dramatizes an inner transformation, da Costa presents a narrative of failed transformation, one that breaks off in the middle, leaving the convert detached and fragmented. Da Costa's religious identity is divided, stuck somewhere between Judaism and Christianity, associated with both, though belonging to neither. Flipping the genre inside out, da Costa himself ends up the other within. Da Costa's moment of religious transformation is the moment when his doubt concerning the new religion begins. As soon as da Costa converts, there is a break between da Costa's perception of Judaism as he created it in his mind and the religion he was asked to practice. The moment of conversion and assimilation into Jewish society emphasized the alienation from that very society. I would like to move to talk about those aspects in da Costa's narrative that are quixotic or Quixote-like. Da Costa decides to fight windmills and to rebel against the Jewish community and publicly express his disagreement with the oral tradition, actions that directly lead to his cherem or excommunication. "I confess," writes da Costa, if I had kept my silence from the beginning and acknowledged the order of the world, it would have been more to my advantage." Here, da Costa recognizes the consequences of defying the Jewish community's leaders. "If I were a different man," says da Costa, "I would have accepted the oppression of tyranny, but I cannot." Da Costa clearly understands that self-control and concealment of one's true feelings and opinions would be better if he wants to live in society. In his words, quote, "free of the persecution of many ignorant or from unjust oppression of tyrants," end quote. He clearly understands the paradox of concealment, of controlled self-expression that conveys a choice of avoiding voicing one's true feelings and thoughts. Though he is well aware of the benefits of such a strategy, he also acknowledges his inability to follow this path, his inability to conceal the truth for his own self-interest. Da Costa presents us with two models. The first is the man he wishes he were, one who accepts the burden of society, one who conceals the truth and does not have to pay such a high price for it. It is a role Da Costa admits he could not perform. The second model is the man he is. He does not hide the truth for self-interest. Da Costa moves from faith to reason, and in the process, both Judaism and Christianity fail him. Returning to the Jewish community is an attempt to conceal the truth and become part of society again, but Da Costa is unable to follow through. He is left in a foreign place, isolated, and lacking any sense of belonging. He writes, "I thought it more honorable to die bravely than to have those mortifying reflections which must necessarily attend a base submission." End quote. The self that is represented here through time is a tortured one, refusing to conceal his doubts, divided between his loyalty to its internal truth and its social needs. Da Costa's choice to remain true to his belief and worldview becomes clear in light of his past. In Portugal, he and his family had to conceal their Jewish identity, maintaining an inner Judaism while outwardly conforming to Catholic worship for fear of the Inquisition. He prefers to die an honorable death than to be deprived of that sense of honor. Da Costa also declares that he was, and I quote, drawn into and deceived by a false religion, that is Judaism, which reveals itself to be fabricated and man-made. Yet the creator of that religion is Da Costa himself. When he creates his private Judaism in Portugal, it is a literary creation based on some aspect of Judaism that he knows, but it is divorced from the oral tradition made mostly from, that is a religion made mostly from his imagination. Since there is no secular alternative to religious life in Da Costa's time, he thus becomes, to society at least, a fictional Jew, a character of and in his own narrative. When reality and fiction clash in Amsterdam, Da Costa faces the specter of what he terms a false religion. He is excluded from the religious world he created. As giants transform to windmills, Da Costa transforms into the other within. Unable to conceal his true opinions and doubts, he becomes a critic of the Jewish society he belongs to, and as such, evokes a fear of the social other. Even though he eventually reconforms, excuse me, Da Costa is never fully able to reintegrate into society. He remains in between. Da Costa's submission to the rabbi's demands comes as a surprise, especially after he describes his sense of honor and his long battle against rabbinic authority. The characteristics that lead him to suicide are those that Da Costa presents early in the narrative as significant and admirable. I quote, "I was naturally very pious and compassionate, in so much that I could not hear the story of any person's misfortunes without melting into tears, and had such an innate sense of modesty that I dreaded nothing so much as to suffer disgrace." He continues, "I took all opportunities to defend the oppressed and to make their cause my own." Much like Quixote, Da Costa defends the oppressed and fights for justice. He uses the singular I and that confronts the plural many, and portrays himself as a hero in an unheroic world. Though he never actually provides examples for his heroic actions. In his narrative, his offenders are imaginary and nameless. Like Quixote, who takes the role of the giant in the night, Da Costa takes on the roles of both the victim and the oppressor. But, say these vile scoffers, trusting in the strength of their number more than that of their cause, what availeth your contending that with us? What can you do against so many? I confess it and lament it as my great misfortune that I am overpowered by your multitude. Excuse me. It is owing to this and your bitter reflections on me that my heart burns with resentment and indignation and makes me think it unlawful to use their play towards such wicked, arrogant, and abandoned wretches. All I can say is, I want the power of revenge. This passage appears after Da Costa's humiliating reconciliation ceremony, and it allows us to enter Da Costa's tormented mind. Up until his reconformity, Da Costa uses first and third person plural points of view, I and they. But from this point on, the narrative voice constantly mixes from first to second to third person points of view, and more importantly, in this speech, Da Costa plays two roles. The oppressed, I am overpowered by your multitude, and the oppressors, what can you do against so many? He is both the self and the other, the one and the many. The constant change of narrative voice and blurring between self and other to Da Costa's fragile mental state. What defines his identity here is the coexistence of the real and imaginary. He sees his persecutors filled with rage and imagines their voices as one. The speech signifies the creation of the literary world, as he takes on both the role of the victim and the oppressors. His language points to Da Costa's divided and tormented self. The other is indeed within. Excuse me. Whether Da Costa's sense of honor is realistic or unrealistic, it stands in stark contrast to his experiences in the real world. Indeed, isolation, degradation, and dishonor are some of the major themes of Da Costa's narrative. Though he emphasizes honor, compassion, and bravery, his ideas must confront reality. When Quijano returns to his village, he breaks from the literary figure, the heroic Quixote who made his life so rich and colorful. By acknowledging his errant self and denouncing him, Quijano returns to reality. Such a break foreshadows his death. Da Costa's life narrative ends not with a conversion from fiction to reality, or from one religion to another, by denouncing any sense of belonging to a religious reality and bestowing the reader with the power of interpretation. Da Costa creates his own fiction, finally transforming into a literary character. Thank you.